thank you everybody for joining us. Great thanks to the organizers of this event, and really great thanks to our wonderful, creative, brilliant participants, and to all the audience that has come out today for Talking Sense: Image, Sound, and Text in Literature. I'm going to say some preliminary, very quick comments before I very quickly introduce our guests, and then hand it off to them to respond to the topic of image, sound, and text in literature. And my comments have to do, as may be expected, with the pandemic. The pandemic has introduced so many contingencies into all our lives, so many difficulties, strains and challenges of all sorts, from the annoying to the critical existential. For us, my family, one of the biggest contingencies, difficulties of the pandemic has been childcare. We have a 3-year-old that has been at home with us for a year now, while we have been working and trying to do our thing. And for a while, we were going at it alone, just us and her, until we realized, well, this is, who knows how long this is going to last. She needs to socialize. So what we did was we formed a childcare bubble with some friends and colleagues of ours here, 3 families, 5 kids, ages 3 to 7. So a little kind of one-room schoolhouse, a rotating one-room schoolhouse developed in our homes, moving from day to day, from home to home. That situation prompted me to read a lot of literature on early childhood education. And in that reading, I became somewhat obsessed with the works of Rudolf Steiner, 19th century, early 20th century German mystic, pedagogue, philosopher. And one of the things that resonated with me the most was what Steiner has to say about how children experience images. And Steiner says that children don't see images with only their eyes. They feel images with their whole bodies. Steiner says that children don't hear music or stories with just their ears. They feel music and stories with their whole bodies. I think that's something akin to what we might call like an inherent radiant textual ontology that children have, that I feel all great art, all great music gives us to. That experience of not hearing with our ears, but hearing with our body, not seeing with our eyes, but seeing with our whole body. And I think also that the writers we have here today, writers though they may be, that is working in text, wish, desire, accomplish something like an entanglement in sight, sound, tactility, and embodiment, giving us an experience akin to the radical textual ontology that little kids bring into the world. That is, something like a broader sensorium than just words on a page. Kristen Radke does so with stunning graphic memoir and evocation of what it is to be alone. Douglas Kearney with sonic poetics and performative typography. Ilya Kaminsky with synesthetic lyricism entangled in new sign languages and puppet theater. Valeria Luiselli with multimedia, multi-documentary fiction and nonfiction and scenes and realities of mass incarceration and movements arrested by the state. And my colleagues will boast and Jennifer Scapatoni, respectively, will, in his storytelling in, around, and through musicians, rhythm, music, non-normative neurologies, and digital nomadism. And Jennifer, with her experiments in poetic resonance across and beyond the page into living and non-living ecologies. So I'm just delighted to have you all here, and very much looking forward to your responses to the interactions of image and sound in your writing and writing work. So thank you, and I'll just hand it right over to Kirsten.
Hi. I'm not going to talk about sound because I'm an illustrator, so I'm going to talk about image. I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Okay, so can you all see a blank screen? Okay, great. So I think we can talk, one of the things I think we get hung up when we talk about graphic work like comics or graphic narratives, graphic novels, graphic memoirs, comic strips, is that there's a lot of words we use to describe them. And I think sometimes we get kind of hung up on that. But we can talk about graphic work in a number of different ways. So Marjane Satrapi calls it narrative drawing. Art Spiegelman calls it picture writing. Alison Bechdel says that the process of reading comics is like learning a new syntax. It's a new way of ordering ideas. When we're thinking about the relationship between text and image, I really love this quote from Renee Gladman. And to write was to think, to make lines was to draw, and lines were the essence of writing. I made the line, and though it couldn't be read, the narrative of my line began instantly. I made a line, it couldn't be read, but I felt the story in my body. It was as experimental as everything else. I made the line while talking in my head, which is what I did while I wrote. So I was writing, but it was a drawing that had accumulated. And I feel like that's what, so I think a lot about, people often ask questions like of illustrators or graphic novelists about why something is illustrated, like why we choose to approach it in that way instead of prose or poetry. And I feel like those questions are limiting because there is no one form for any project. Like, I don't ever believe that there's a perfect form. Like, I don't believe that something can exist better as a play than it can as a novel, or better as a graphic novel than it can as a poem. I think we just use the tools that are available to us as an artist. Sometimes that's sound, sometimes that's image, sometimes that's text, sometimes that's rhyme. And so I love this quote when I'm thinking about those things, the way that it's just, how can you get the story, the idea, the feeling out of you? And maybe that's a drawing, maybe that's not text. So Hilary Shute, who's one of our most important living scholars, says, comic scholars, says that we can think of comics as a site-specific form of literature. In this way, too, comics can also be like poetry, in which line breaks and stanzas and the arrangement of words on a page all carry meaning. So I'm actually not going to talk for too long before I turn it over, but the thing I want the main thing I think I want to leave you all with when thinking about comics or graphic narratives is that the most important thing to consider is that graphic work is not actually illustrative. It's not about creating an image that matches a piece of text. It's not about writing a beautiful paragraph about someone walking down the street and then drawing someone walking down the street, at least not if it's going to function effectively. It's about pairing graphics and text as a way that changes or challenges the relationship between the two. And I think that can even come down to things like pacing. Like, for example, if I was going to draw a scene of, like a man waking up in the middle of the night to make a midnight snack, like, I probably don't need to draw him pulling off the covers, like one foot hitting the floor, the next foot hitting the floor, him walking across the hallway, then like each foot down the stairs, then like the creak of the refrigerator door open, like him pulling out the mayonnaise. I don't know what weird snack he's making at midnight with mayonnaise, but you get the gist. So I probably don't need to show all of those steps to communicate the breadth of what's happening there. Like, I can pick, like pieces from like the 30-second mark. But what if this is the last meal that he eats before he fasts for a dangerous surgery? Or what if this is the first meal he's made for himself, like after his partner has died and his partner always woke up and made him a snack when he was hungry, or like after he got up his shift. Like suddenly each one of those steps carries this extraordinary amount of meaning. And I think there's significance in how much we demonstrate. So I really do think that images function or can function in the same way as text. It's just about making decisions about what you're showing, why, where you're slowing us down, where you're drawing the eye, and where you're paying attention. So I'll turn it over to whoever's next.
Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you very much for having me here, and I'm very grateful to be presenting among these really fine artists. All right, so let's just start screen sharing. So I'm going to be talking today a little bit about the idea of textuality and texturality, and that's something that you know, when you were talking about radical textual ontology, that's very resonant to me, because a lot of my work and thoughts, even in terms of like lexical composition, are rooted in traditions like sampling in hip hop, where it's not just that you want a certain note progression. It's not just that you want doom doom doo 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 doo. You want the texture from the 1975 recording from this particular studio matched with a drum breaks sample from another year, and that those multiple textures create a different kind of textuality through the timbre. And so I just wanted to show a couple of things that have influenced the approaches to visual work that I've been taking on. You know, graffiti, including like bathroom wall graffiti, mostly now. Here's something from Basquiat. Here is Marinetti futurist work. Here's something from Susan Howe, which was really important in the kind of latter, in some of my recent work. Susan Howe's work has been very important. These are a couple of panels from Mike Mignola's Hellboy, sort of pacing out the storytelling. And here's some work by Augusto de Campos. Oh, and here is Deborah Richards. And I wanted to just show the sort of movement into visuals and sound by also showing some process. This is a page from a journal from my book Patter. This is what it looks like for me to do a first draft and then move that over into, in this case, a software called InDesign. InDesign is great for textuality, but I've found InDesign has been less satisfying for texturality, because InDesign, once you type it up, it all looks as smooth as everything else. Everything shares a texture. Even if you're using a font that's supposed to look texturized, it repeats that same shape and same texture every time. Here's a poem called That Loud Ass Colored Silence Protest. Also an InDesign textuality poem. And the important thing with the textual poems, even when they're in the performative typography like this, is I can read them. I feel like I can perform them, and that's going to become important when I talk about texturality. Just a couple of examples, other ones. This is a page from an opera called Ben Bannock, and this is really where you see the Mike Mignola influence, I think, in terms of pacing. All the boxed text represents stage directions. All right, so let's just kind of move on to the meat. All right, so I'm going to show you all a video so you can see how I make the poems that I'm calling Photoshop poems or collage poems. So let's just do this real quick. So that track is Jay Dilla's working on it, and you know, it uses the styles of composition that I'm very much interested in, chopping and creating new compositions based upon older work, pre-existing work. Just to get back to the presentation, let's see, where are we? Ah, yeah. So What's important though, and this is something that Kristen said, not illustrative. I can't read this poem, partially because I think it would be distracting for me to try to change my voice to fit the texture of these letters. Like, it's one thing to go, oh, large text, make that loud, small text, make that quiet. But there's a difference between this and that spun spin, which I think if you're looking at it, doesn't bother you at all in terms of parsing it out in your head. But if I were to perform it, it would become very distracting as I changed vocal registers. And so I'm going to leave it there because my time is almost up. But a poem like this would require a machine like this to perform accurately. I can map the sounds along all these different drum pads and then play them in a kind of audio collage that wouldn't be illustrative. It wouldn't be saying warning to avoid injury, but would suggest those same sources. That should do it for me. Thanks.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you. Ilya?
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentations. It's really an honor to be here with you guys and to just watch you in action. I really am having a lot of fun. So just to tell a little bit about where I'm coming from. For me, Image is more or less a native language, simply because I did not have hearing aids growing up, and I'm hard of hearing. So everything I learned as far as language or sentences or lines are concerned have to do with Image, which I consider an international language since I was growing up in USSR. What does that mean to say that Image is an international language? It means that you're walking on the streets and watching on the opposite side of the street two people talk, and you can gather scraps of their sentences, even though you can hear them. You can see their lips moving. And you also see the pigeons on a windowsill, and you see the cat drinking out of a puddle, and two kids fighting, and two adults chatting, and somebody else is kissing. And all of that is a part of your sentence. Coming to US, I wrote my first book, Deaf Republic, in what I thought was more homages, elegies for Russian poets and family history and all that. But years later, probably a decade later, I looked at it with fresh eyes after not having read it for a while, and I realized that 90% of the time, the poetic device I was using was an image. I realized that I really was writing a book in images, not in English. And I'm also translating once in a while. And I find that there are two things that work quite well in translation, and that is image or metaphor or simile, or tone. Those things are a lot easier to translate than, say, rhyme or alliteration or assonance. For example, Blake's Tiger, Tidy, Barney, Bright in the Forest of the Night and all that ends up being a poem about a big cat in Russian. But some things can get translated rather well, and here we are moving towards the idea of text, which is syntax. Syntax can be incredible in translation, and a classic example is probably somebody like Paul Celan in the 20th century, who is completely changing the idea of German in the mid-20th century, responding to Holocaust and trying to fight the Nazism inside the language in German. And all of that being done through line breaks, through clashes of words, through unpredictable syntax. And it shouldn't work in English, and yet it does. In some ways, syntax can be like traffic signs. It tells you when to speed up, when to slow down, when to turn right, when to turn left, when to start running, when to start whispering, and all that. want to jump from that particular dash. So I find those things interesting, but probably coming from Eastern Europe, which is to say from Russian-based language culture, in my case, I'm almost always wondering about the age of literature, because when we are talking about Russian literature here in the United States, we are thinking, oh, this great ancient literature. Well, that's not true at all. Russian literature is extremely young. Pushkin, the originator of modern Russian literature, was writing Evgeny Onegin, his epic novel in verse, in, say, 1824. What the heck is 1824 for English literature? English literature had so many centuries by then. What does that mean? That means that Russian in some ways is closer to the spoken tradition, to the mnemonic, to the kind of literature that needs to be memorized. Which often comes not with rhyme, early Russian songs say, but with repetition. And if you think about, that's where I'm trying to move from image into sound and why I still find it so important. If you think about not even Russian or Eastern European, but how poetic devices can be much older than literature itself. For example, in anthropology class, in the very beginning, a teacher might say in Anthropology 101, an example about human beings on the continent of Africa gathering around the campfire, not being able to speak yet. And then the shaman would say something like fire, 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 until they drop, meaning that the language, which was just beginning, was carrying more of an agency than the meaning of the word itself. It was a spell, a casting of a spell. And that is something that poetic devices have. They're older than information. It carries something else. And that is kind of the intersection of sound and image that I'm interested in. And I'm happy to talk later more about it, but at this point, I think I have taken up my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. I love this idea of the motility of syntax and the spells that are possible through it. Fire, fire, burning bright. Valeria, please.
Thank you, Ilya and Kirsten and Douglas. So far, I feel like I'm in a master class of creative process, and yeah, I haven't been in a panel with this intensity in a while, and it's such a pleasure. I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't know if I missed an email. I'm also really shitty at PowerPoint, so I think I'm glad for you that I don't have one. I'll talk a little bit about my process so far, and how I think about image and sound with respect to my work. And then maybe if there's time, a little bit about how I'm wondering about the interaction between sound and text right now, like where I'm stuck and what I'm thinking and where I'm like trying to figure things out. So far in my literary work, I guess, in my novels and essays, image and sound have always been just part of the method, part of the process of documentation, just a way that I collect the world somehow, and a method, a very peculiar method of collecting for me, because both methods, that is recording sound and recording through pictures, I usually use Polaroids, help me observe or listen to the world with a particular kind of attention when I'm doing that, right? When I'm recording or when I'm focusing and trying to take a particular still, I am kind of preparing my mind, I feel, to observe or experience in a particular way. So it's a way of gazing, I guess, and a way of listening that then produces a kind of like everyday debris, right? Just like the process of something in the make, right? And in some of my books, not all, but in some of them, and especially that maybe the last two novels, the things with which I made those novels, the Polaroids that helped me sequence ideas, that helped me kind of draw those lines. Ilya was saying, I made a line while talking in my head, from what you were quoting, Kirsten, but then he wrote, I made a line while talking in my head, but felt a story in my body. I love that, absolutely, because it's exactly like the way that that one is composing, right? While like way before one is actually in the moment of composition. For me, the Polaroid process particularly helps me. And then later, like once I'm deep into the process of writing and I'm feeling lost, I always go back to those Polaroids and I'm able to kind of sequence them, right? Kind of write sentences with them and understand where I am, because I never follow a blueprint, or I don't have a story with a idea of plot before I write, or not even often during the process of writing. I'm always kind of, every day that I sit down, I don't know where I'm going, right? And there's no blueprint, so I need those helpers, I guess, that debris of the process, of the pre-process of making, to help me along when I'm there. And I guess that over the years has led me to be really interested in the question of how to understand the distance between process or method and the final result, and not only understand that distance, but also how to shorten the distance between process and result in a way that the process is palpable, or visible, like kind of messy fingerprints in the final result, which in my case is a book, usually a book. And I'm interested in the process being kind of visible in the book, because I think that it turns a book into a much more porous object, right? Not something that's like packaged and finished and closed, but something that will remain porous and will change over the years, and that each time a mind interacts with it, that mind can alter it a little bit more, right? Because it's not quite finished. No, there's a porosity to it. I don't know if my 5 minutes are up, but I'll just quickly say about like where I am now and where I'm stuck and what I'm thinking about is now the characters in my last novel were sound people, were like sound documentarians. And I had no previous experience of sound anything except recording some things on my phone. But I had to do a lot of research naturally and talk to a lot of people that were experts in that, so that I could make my characters come alive in the page, right? And so I, of course, became very enamored with that way of documenting, with that way of producing work. And I'm now working with a couple of sound artists, sound producers, on the next project that I'm working on, which is for now tentatively called Echoes from the Borderlands. And it's a 24-hour sound piece that talks about the histories of violence against land and against the female body in the US-Mexico borderlands, from the moment that the border was being drawn with the exact shape it has now today. So that's around the Gadsden Purchase in the 1850s until today. But there's many layers and that I can show you an image that I didn't make, one of my collaborators did. That's pretty. Let's see, share screen thing. This is the share screen. So yeah, I'll talk. I have an event tonight in which I'll play some fragment that we've worked on so far. But this is like the border region, as you can see. The piece would go from San Diego, Tijuana, moving towards Brownsville, Matamoros in 24 hours, which is the amount of time it takes to drive from, if you drove in a straight line, kind of, if you drove along the US side of the border along the roads, it's about 24 hours according to Google. Of course, it's much more, right? But and so the piece goes from sun to sun, 24 hours from ocean to ocean, recording the histories around things like this that you see here. You know? So from eugenics in California, is that better? Eugenics and kind of agricultural devastation, exploitation in California, the Japanese internment camps, and the demarcation of the border. In Arizona, mining, sexual violence, prisons, the Chiricahuas, vigilantism, reservations, and environmental violence. These are, of course, all movable, tentative, and will change and grow, and so on and so forth with the rest. And so what I'm going to show you now is just a tiny, like 1 minute clip. So you can hear the kind of things that we're working on in order to do this. And what I'm going to show you combines like reenactment with, I guess, the history, the material history of the border wall. Is it that one when I'm going to show you? No, I think it's not that one I'm going to show you. Or maybe it is, let's see. So, but you'll hear, like, what you'll hear is different recordings made at the border last year, right before the pandemic. So there might be some sounds of motorcycles, wind. You might be able to listen to the sound of a saguaro thorn playing. And Douglas, one of my collaborators, he uses exactly that machine the Appleton and whatever that the one is called with the buttons, right? So he records the sessions in that, and so we've done a bit live. What I'm gonna play tonight is kind of a little piece that we did live, and so he, like, when we're live, I can read, and he's playing those funky buttons. But here quickly, okay. This is Natalie Diaz.
In Naco, Arizona, we thought we might have maybe heard some angels. They were riding loud motorbikes.
Can you turn it up a little bit?
Sunburned chins and cheeks hung long, heavy, slightly coiled beards, except for the one lady who did not have a beard at all, and dismounting her bike, ankle swollen, water-retaining varicosed, stood right in front of the wall and exclaimed, oh my, it's real. Like the sand that was real, like the sun that was real, like the sky that was an unbelievably deep shade of blue. She was from Seattle, had gone down to visit her wall, she said, was astonished, flabbergasted, she might have said impressed. Standing next to her less impressionable husband, who with well-practiced patience explained. Well, he explained many things. He said, let me explain. This is the point. You see, here's how it works. And as he spoke, the concertina wire that curls and spirals and spreads along miles and miles, we noticed, was not on the Mexican side, but on the US side of the wall, which seemed like pissing outside the hole. Difficult to explain. No, not difficult to explain, difficult to justify. Que no es lo mismo.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Valeria. Will?
Thanks, Edgar, and thanks for everyone. This is fascinating to experience and be a part of. I'm just going to pop up a PDF real quick. So probably the two most important things in my life have been music, specifically learning jazz drums and sentences. And I don't exactly know how the two are connected, but I know that they have been pretty profound influence on everything that I've tried to do creatively. And I think one thing that's important for me to have realized is that the thing that maybe unites them is that they're all about calibration and touch and fine tuning texture and finding a balance, right? People think that playing drums is a primal experience, and for sure it partly is, but it's also really an art of subtlety as well. Somewhere along the way, I also got interested in the modernists and their experiments with verbal music. And you can see this quote from Virginia Woolf from one of her first novels. What I want to do in writing novels is very much what you want to do when you play piano, I expect. He began turning and speaking over his shoulder. We want to find out what's behind things, don't we? And the modernists, I think, were obsessed with this like kind of almost alchemical idea that instead of merely describing experience, they could use verbal music to like create the experience itself in the reader, right? And I think that's really fascinating in Woolf and Joyce, and can sometimes be a little overmuch. For example, when you look at certain D.H. Lawrence, it starts to feel like congealed fat a little bit, you know, like it's a little too much. So a sentence that I've thought a lot about over the years is this one from Joyce's Araby. And I'm basically stealing what Frank O'Connor said about this sentence in his study of the short story, The Lonely Voice. And what O'Connor notes is that, well, a few things really. Well, one, there's no punctuation here, and somehow or another that feels right. But he also notes that this is the exact right order of the adjectives, you know, that you can't improve on the order of these adjectives. If you were to scramble them and do them in a different order, the empty, high, cold, gloomy rooms, or the gloomy, cold, high, empty rooms, it wouldn't be as good somehow or another, right? And so one thing that O'Connor says is that it's as if Joyce has worked the order of these adjectives out experientially. He's describing a young boy, about sort of 10, 11-year-old boy, going into these rooms. And because he's a little boy, he first notices that the rooms are high. Then he notices that they're cold. And then he starts to have this sort of totalizing impressions, right? That they're empty, and thus finally that they are gloomy, right? And I think that's absolutely right. But I think another thing to note here is that they get sort of progressively longer as sounds as they go along, right? High, cold, empty, and finally gloomy, which is like quite a bit longer word there. So I think that they kind of build on each other in terms of length as well. And then the other obvious thing I think to note here is that we have this repetition of gloom and room, and then from room to room singing, right? So that kind of high, hollow ooh sound ends up being, even if you're not reading it aloud, kind of the overall kind of sense impression you have of that sentence, right? That it's an ooh, like, but it's a kind of ghostly, kind of haunted feeling in a way. Another sentence that I've thought a lot about in my life is a sentence by Tobias Wolff. It's actually my memory of this sentence as what I think of as like a sentence that I would love to one day write as good a version of, right? Nobody was here to see two pugilistic sciences dance prettily around each other. They wanted two slope-shouldered brutes pounding each other into goulash. When I went and looked this up, this is not actually the sentence, it's this. Nobody wanted to see artful flyweights dance up and down, moving their shoulders prettily while darting in for another scientific love tap. They wanted to see slope-shouldered bruisers stand toe-to-toe and pound each other into goulash. They wanted to see blood. They wanted to see pain, which of course is also amazing. And I think the thing for me to note here as a kind of, you know, student of this stuff is that this first sentence is, you know, that more Latinate, you know, kind of vocabulary, artful, flyweight, prettily, scientific, right? You can even hear how those words are a little bit more dainty than the words to come. And then, of course, the next sentence here, bruisers, pound, goulash, right? And I think the killer word here is goulash, right? Because stew wouldn't work, right? You know, bouillabaisse wouldn't work. It has to be goulash, right? You know, it has to be that exact calibration of not only sound, but also kind of like a little bit of a joke there as well, right? And then, of course, these two punctuating sentences here. Another sentence that I've walked around with in my head for forever, but I've never actually been able to find it, is another by Deborah Eisenberg. She wrote as if a basket of fruit had just been dropped on her head. And I think that's more or less what the actual sentence is. But again, going back through all her stories, I've never somehow been able to find it. But anyway, it's such a wild image. It's so far out, and yet it somehow works. So my attempt at this in my own writing, and this is a description of a 12-year-old boy sitting in on tuba with polka bands in the Midwest, is this: they strained and labored and lost themselves in their rollicking, flatulent music. And that, I think, is maybe one of the better sentences I've written. When I actually went back to look at what it really was, it was this, which was close. To sit alongside these men so close I could feel the bovine warmth of their wide bodies, could feel the way they strained and labored and lost themselves in their rollicking, flatulent music, etc., etc. I think I actually got a little sentimental at the end, but anyway, what I've wanted to do with the sentence, and I think I did somewhat do, was just the sounds in the middle there. They strained and labored and lost themselves. That seems right to me somehow or another. And then putting rollicking and flatulent next to one another, which tonally is a bit of a mismatch, right? You know, flatulent is kind of a goofy word put in this thing that's supposed to be a semi-transcendent experience, although when you're describing polka, it has to be kind of ridiculous in some way, right? Was the thing that interested me about this sentence. And actually, I just heard in Valeria's piece something very similar. It was spirals and curls and miles of wire, right? Like spirals gets us to miles, gets us to wire, right? And I think we all know that too much of this starts to feel a little, too much. But I'm obsessed with this stuff, I guess. And so the other thing I think for me, thinking about the connections between music and prose is to go back to a couple comments previously. It also has to do with tone. And so I'm just going to play two clips of the same song, but performed by two very different people. And I'll just do this very quickly here. So that's Miles Davis doing Someday My Prince Will Come, and here's the original.
Love ya, did he steal a kiss?
He was so romantic, I could not resist. Someday my prince will come. Someday we'll meet again. And away to his castle.
Back to Miles just for a second. Well, okay, anyway, you get the picture. And the original, the Disney version, is a beautiful song performed by a beautiful singer with a lot of vibrato. It sounds kind of old-fashioned now. It's melancholy, it's a little schmaltzy with those heavenly strings. And the amazing thing is that what Miles does is he takes his dry, sometimes acidic, sometimes sour, but piercing tone and makes this melody really poignant, right? And really plays with the phrasing and the subtlety of the phrasing a lot. And I think that, we think that like warmth and singing qualities should always be the kind of the thing we aspire to, but I think that actually a certain coldness and a certain pungency and a certain again acidity can be really cool in the arts and in writing as well. And probably one of my favorite sentence writers right now is Rachel Cusk, and I just wanted to show just a little excerpt from her, because when I think of someone who's able to do that dryness and that coldness and that kind of piercing quality, that kind of acidic quality. I think she's one of the best at that. And you can just see how penetrating and devastating this passage is from Outline. Okay, thank you.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Jen.
Wow, this has been amazing. I don't even want to talk. I just want to follow up with what everyone has already said. But I am going to just read something which I decided, in the interests of time, this is like all precisely timed, to just say something about a current project I'm doing that it won't confine itself to a given medium or form. And in that way, it's like an earlier project of mine. So I'm going to say something about that, and hopefully it'll be extrapolatable. 15 years ago, trying ineptly to help my mother survive chemotherapy by researching my neighborhood cancer cluster's possible causes, I learned of the term airborne plume through a digitized document produced in the 1990s by the EPA's Superfund program, addressing our block's defunct copper mill and dump. I learned that air and soil could be conceived as contaminant transport media. Not having been trained at school in glossing the euphemisms of corporatized science, I decided to patch together an understanding, or perhaps just a coping strategy, into a closet opera of salvaged language and semi-linguistic scraps. Over the course of 2020, poetic language became to me increasingly inaccessible and remote from the immediacy of respiratory crisis on planetary, national, and familial levels. The lyrics of the birds, theretofore largely unheeded by me, carved out cognitive space as the human world recoiled from itself into screens, and United Statesians were confined to their own private syllables. Human languages evolved along with fine motor skills that make modifications to quiet breathing possible, dilated expirations punctuated by quick inspirations. The pandemic foisted that signature breath control of the species out of our grasp. So did the police. More and more minoritized humans became more and more like the canary, a sentinel species, martyred to growth's semblance of control. With friends across the world, I started a Zoom puppet musical in the dark to link us across all the forgetful national language organs, a broken chorus of rape and repair.
Tuhinga o mua, ki te whakamahi, ki te mahi kore.
Una jaula llena de oxígeno para agarrar un monumento cayendo.
一个装满氧气的牢笼，抓住正在掉落的纪念碑。
Une cage pleine d'oxygène pour attraper un monument en train de tomber.
برای نگه داشتن بنای یاد بودی که فرو می‌ریزد.
Una gabbia colma di ossigeno per acciuffare un monumento cadente.
充满氧气的笼子，接住坠落的纪念碑。
「
Enter the bi-voiced Syrinx.
A cage full of oxygen to catch a falling monument.
一个充满氧气的牢笼，接住一个下落的纪念碑。
Our Serenette's little hunt for the monument. Serenus Canaria in Carboni Fodina.
A ventilator for
气候
the
金丝雀
climate
的呼吸
canary
机，
from
来
the
自氧
father
气
of
治疗之
oxygen
父。
therapy.
Okay, I'll stop it there in the interest of
That's so beautiful, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
We can go a little bit over time. If my selfish self were, if I let my selfish self do its thing right now, I would have so many questions for each one of you, individually and as a group. But I hope that you all may have some questions for each other, and I will let that take the lead. But the main thing that I noticed, just to quickly say something, is that tonality is really important for all your works. And when I learned about tone, I learned about it as an attitude toward the text and toward the audience. And the attitude in your works, the tone, the intonation, the way in which you incorporate image and sound in order to relate to the text and to the audience feels to me across the board as one of radical care. And I wonder if you all can talk about care, intellectual, political, aesthetic, and maybe also for the ones of you who are working more solidly in music, about melody. And melody is something that, you know, I happened to be on a similar Zoom call yesterday, or Zoom event with Fred Moten, and we were talking about Sun Ra. And Fred Moten said that Sun Ra is somebody that can't let the melody go. He just wants to hang on to the melody. And then we talked a little bit more, and we kind of came to something a little bit more specific, which is actually the melody won't let him go. He's got to stay in the sound. There's something about melody and music that captivates, captures, and transfixes him in such a way that he has to work himself out of it. So those are just two prompts to begin a conversation. I know we're basically at time, but we can go a few minutes over if you will. I know some of you have to leave to talk about tone and melody. There are also questions in the chat box about silence, process, and Tupac. So those are also prompts if you want to talk about. My answer is, if everybody talked like Tupac, we'd have no K-Dot. So, you know, like stuff changes, it grows.
If it's all right, I'll jump in on melody. And also K-Dot, Tupac. I mean, like, one of the things that really drove the textural stuff and ideas of composition is the opening to Kendrick Lamar's Humble, where before the beat really kicks in, he does this, yeah, yeah, like that moment. And I didn't want like Garamond, Y-E-A-H, Y-E-A-H. There's like, that's not the same thing as yeah, yeah. And there is an intentionality in the performance of that melody. Something I say to my students a lot is the letter O-H, the word O-H on a poem or a text, you can see it O-H. But that O-H, the difference between, say, T.I.'s, oh, and the Shy Lights, oh, that's the same word, but it's absolutely not the same word. So melody, as a part of the vehicle of that communication, does something really powerful. And I think the closest thing I can think of to being similar to not being able to be let go of by melody is pun and verbal association at that level. Like there's the point where you can follow the kind of pun or the associative into a space where it feels like you get lost in it. And that being lost in it isn't necessarily, I mean, depending upon the reader, you know, or the viewer or whatever, mileage may vary. But for me, melody, when I think about it, if I were to make a kind of an analogous thing in type and lexicality or whatever, I think of pun. For me, I don't think that's a universal idea.
I guess I could say something quick about melody. I'm really interested in melody as manipulation, and lyric poetry as manipulative, and the kind of, because like when I was growing up, I didn't come from a family of people who went to college or had books besides like the lives of the saints and the Bible. So I would just sing commercials all day long because they were like my poetry. And so I'm really interested in like that kind of melody and how it gets under your skin. And I've been really interested in poetry in like kind of manipulating lyric and showing how it manipulates us. So on like the darker side of things, and the melody in that piece, that instrument is called a serenette, and it's this invention of Enlightenment France, that like cranking thing, and its purpose was to train canaries to sing. They didn't have song because they were trapped in cages, they were raised in captivity. And so, but they still wanted the canaries to sing because that was the canaries' prized possession. So I'm really interested in how like human wiles, you know, create these melodies and then try to manipulate others, even other species. The piece that, you know, it's called La Petite Chasse, or The Little Hunt. So it's actually about a small game hunt. So it's actually a song that's a hunting song for hunting birds. And so the canaries are, you know, putatively being trained to sing the song that will accompany their own hunting. So I'm just super interested in kind of getting into and getting out of melody. So I won't say anything more, but yeah, I could talk for hours about that issue.
Maybe I'll switch tracks from music, sound to image. And I have a direct question for Valeria, and also a somewhat direct question, but somewhat open for Kirsten. For Valeria, why Polaroids? And why not just photographs? What is it about the Polaroid specifically that is important for your work? And for Kirsten, you know, I loved how you talked about setting up a scene through what sounded to me like cinematic cuts. And I wanted to know about your relation or your thinking, or, you know, does your work at all draw from cinema and movies?
I'll be very quick because it's a kind of a boring answer. It's not. I in like 2003 13 or so, when my kid was very, very little, like maybe 2 or 3 years old. And I was still a student and trying to get as many gigs as possible, like writing gigs. I received an email from a place called Visual Editions in the UK, and they wanted to do this project with mapping and maps, because they had, I guess, read my first book, which was a lot about mapping and walking cities and thinking about cartographies in different ways. Anyway, they asked me to write a map, and I was like, oh my God, like, okay. I was in like deep childcare moment then, and also trying to do my PhD exams. And so anyway, I had a little time, and I decided to do a map that somehow involved my daughter so that I could work and mother at the same time. And so we did a map of all the swings in Harlem, which is where she grew up and where we lived for 10 years. And so we went to every single swing in Harlem, and while she did swinging, I took notes, and there was a visual documentation, but I started taking pictures with my phone, and she would get really annoyed. She kept on telling me like, Mama, look at the world, look at me, don't look at your phone. And I wanted her to be part of the process. So I asked a friend to lend me his Polaroid camera, and then she became deeply involved with the whole thing, because it's a fun, beautiful object that spits out a photo. And then with the new ones, you have to hide the photo from the light. It's not like the ones we used to have when we were younger, that you did this and then they came out as opposite. You have to hide them. It's a whole process, and she became really involved in the process. And from then on, I've used Polaroids to document, like, first because it was just, it helped me through that particular commission, and then also because I could always go back to those pictures. If I look on my phone, I'll never find the picture that I know. Like, there's so many idiotic pictures on my phone and screenshots and photos of menus and photos of like medical cards. Like, I'll never find the material again. But here it's just like a small selection of things that I know have an intentionality, and the origin of which were just to not bore the hell out of my kid and have her participate in my commission.
Edgar, I'm sorry, could you restate your question?
Yeah, I just want to say that was also not boring at all.
No,
yeah. No, I just wanted to know, when you were describing that scene of a guy going down to make something in the fridge in the middle of the night and setting the emotional stakes up for that, how you don't have to show every moment, but you can select, cut, develop in something that sounded to me like a cinematic mode. Just like the feet, right? A shot of the feet down the stairs, the hand on the refrigerator, and then the mayonnaise. And my question was really, well, do you interact with cinema? Is cinema important for you? Is film important for you in thinking about the graphic memoir? I also have to say that I absolutely loved the line that you shared with us, the quote, that a line, like a physical, a grapheme, a line is, body.
Yeah, that was Renee Gladman. Yeah, it's an amazing quote. I mean, the short answer is about cinema is no. I mean, I love film, but I don't, I think like a graphic novel is sort of, it can be like a storyboard, like it looks more like maybe what a storyboard would be at the early stages of creating a film, but they function so differently just because, certainly like framing can be similar or something like that, but, something that takes 15 seconds on 20 seconds, 30 seconds to do on film, and that's, an hour and a half. In a graphic novel, it could be pages, which is a lot of space. So I think they function really, really differently in that way. And then too, because like the shape of panels and stuff are malleable, it's like the gaze can change in a way that's like you can't change the shape of the television, as you're making a film. So I think that, and like, of course we can talk about like how frames change and stuff like that. But I think in general, no, I haven't. It's not something I think about very often when I'm drawing. I think about visual art, like still static imagery a little bit more than I think about film.
Thank you. And one last open question, which I feel draws on some things that came up in the chat box, is about color. We've talked a lot about text, image, sound. How do you all think about color in your writing? Breaking past the black and white of alphabetism and text on the page.
I don't mind jumping in on this one too. I think of color similarly to the way I think about motion, like animating a text. Like the video I showed is a process video. It's not like, I don't think about that as the piece. It's there to see how it works. So for me, every aspect is deeply considered. As much as anything is considered, right? So having a different register of colors outside of, say, the poetic textual object of, usually like a page and just black ink on it, adds a level of signification that I can't keep track of. Plus, when it comes to color, I'm super basic. Like red means blood, right? And so to me, the moment there's red on a page, it's not even just like abstractly like violet color. I know it's like that's blood. And so to me, to have to write in such a way that would pull that sense, that color language away from it, would be to then be writing about using the color of red and what red means. And so I had a piece that was really doing that. I could see it. But for me, it's just like I did those kind of like InDesign poems for about 5 years. And what I would do is I would let readers tell me how to read it. I would pass out a copy and a pen and say, number it, sequence it. Because I didn't know how to read them and order them. And I did that for like 5 years before I would just take a poem and just read it improvisationally on my own. Because I learned during that 5 years of getting those poems back that nobody starts in the same place once you have an open field kind of play. Nobody does that. People will read things 4 times. People will miss whole sections, right? So, but I felt like I had to make sure that was the case before I just picked up one of those poems and said, I'm gonna do it like this. So the color for me is something I've been talking about with some students from Colorado College. That's like an amazing thing that my bandwidth just like shuts down when I start thinking about that. But I love the idea. I don't know how to do it yet.
Edgar, I could maybe say something in a different direction, which is, I think that for me, I think that my experience of musicality and color is so much different, as a prose writer, because I think that despite having these other interests, I feel like I've committed really hard to, just sentences, you know what I mean, and just paragraphs, and visually at most a section break here and there, And I think what's interesting to me about Woolf and Joyce, and to a certain extent Lawrence, is Woolf is a little different, but they didn't really ever do anything mixed media that I know of anyway. Maybe I'm wrong there, and so I only think of color maybe in the way of diction, you know what I mean? That certain words are more garish than others, or certain words are more elegant than others, But it's amazing to me that, so much can be suggested with just black and white marks on a white page. You know what I mean? It's like kind of an amazing thing amazing translative power that it has all by itself. So the only way I would think about color is, can I put a really garish word next to a really elegant word and have it make any kind of sense, or make it have just barely any sense. I think that Deborah Eisenberg sentence, my version of it, she woke as if a bucket of fruit had been dropped on her head. Like that comparison should make zero sense, and it's really garish in a way, but somehow it's also really elegant and beautiful too.
Edgar, you asked about silence. Apparently that came up in the chat. And I would just love to hear Ilya talk more about, if it's okay, because we haven't heard from Ilya in the Q&A, like that amazing sequence that you gave us. And you said something similar in your conversation with Rachel last night of, as someone who reads lips, like language is an image, and then it's like leveled in my understanding of what you're saying is it's like on the same level as the bird you see, or, you know, a guy tripping in the street or whatever. And that kind of blows my mind, thinking about that. And I was wondering about, you said that they're images and they're not in English. And I was wondering if they have a sound in your mind, and if they kind of can be transposed from one language into another, since you're thinking across languages all the time, for instance.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for this great talk. To my mind, silence is something that lives inside of music. There is no music without silence. Without silence, music is just continuous noise. You were talking about manipulation. Well, silence is what makes rhythm out of music, what makes a melody out of music. I guess what I'm interested in is this whole idea that poetry is not about an event, it is an event. Just to make sure folks follow my accent, I have just posted something now in the chat. It is from Marina Tsvetaeva. It's one of the final things that she wrote in her diary. And it has to do with silence, but with charged silence. When she says, my difficulty in writing poems, and perhaps others people's difficulty in understanding them, is the impossibility of my goal. For example, of using words to express a moan, to express a sound using words, using meanings. So that the only thing left in the ears would be, why such goals? And that is the kind of silence I'm interested in. You could call it a charged silence, if you will, but there are many other ways to call it. Many years ago, I was a kid at the Poetry Festival listening to the conversation with Yigura Amihai, when another poet asked him a question. The poet forgot the questions, the list of questions, and so the first thing that came up to mind was, what is poetry? And Amihai was already dying of cancer at that time, so she was a little bit quick in his response. And he said, well, you see, I have a mic. If you have a knee here, if I hit you with a knee, with a mic on your knee, you will say, that is poetry. That kind of course, we talk about language, of course, we talk about images, but there is kind of a force that moves it all, and we happen to call it silence because our vocabulary is limited. But we want to have that energy in poems, because without it, the poems are just craft. They may be gorgeous craft, they may be fantastic craft, but they're just craft. It is this kind of raw energy that moves it, that doesn't necessarily need the information, but it does have passion, it has feeling, it has a charge. And that is the kind of silence I'm interested in. It can come with images, it could come with music, it can come with narrative, with all kinds of things. But it got to be there for an art to be an art for me.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And with that, we are at time, and I just want to thank the participants. It's a wonderful note to end on, the idea that when dealing with the text and the text relation to image and sound, there is something like an intellectual or political horizon of impossibility, that is in fact a source of constant possibility, something that you're always striving for, animated by, and living in. So thank you all so much for your contributions, your conversation. This has been a truly special gathering. And thank you everyone for joining.